Before we analyse a running record, first we need a running record to analyse. So I'll take you through the text now and show you what the child said as they were reading this particular text. The child said, "Up on a hill in the middle of a forest there once lived," and the child made an appeal asking the teacher, "What does that say?" And the teacher said, "Lived." And the child then continued on, "A mouse named Sam." You'll see with running records it can become a little bit messy if you need to put in quite a few annotations. So with the lived, where I've got live and then asked and then told, we've lost the tick above the A. So it's quite acceptable not to tick if you have the text in front of you like I do here. It comes down to personal preference. If you've not ticked, the implication is that the child read the word correctly. In the next line, the child said, "Sam lived in a very little house that was far too little for a tiny little mouse." So you can see here that even though I've not ticked every single word, I do have two annotations, the two words that the child read incorrectly. Here the child said, "But Sam didn't live alone in that very and then asked what the word is. The child appealed. The teacher told the child what the word was, and at this point the child went all the way back to but and reread, reading the word correctly. But Sam didn't live alone in that very large house. He lived in that house with his very best friend, Ben the bear. Here the child said, "They live happily together, all." So here the child is sounding the word out, but doesn't blend the word together into one whole. One day, Ben turned to Sam and said, "This house is too small for the two of us." "I must find a house of my own," Sam replied. Now you'll notice here that the child didn't pause at the full stop and ran through to "Sam replied" and paused here. So even though with a running record you don't analyse that as an error, I still like to put it into the running record because you'll see here that this will have changed the meaning of what the author was trying to say. By reading through that full stop and pausing at the end of "Sam replied," it changed who said, "I must find a house of my own." It's changed the meaning of the text. Then for the final sentence, the child said, "This, the," and self-corrected on their own, "The house will be too large for a tiny little mouse." So if we go back up to the very top, we're now going to record how many errors and how many self-corrections occurred during this running record. In the first line, we have one error, so I put it in the error column. You'll see with the next two errors, they're on the same line. So instead of writing the number 2, I'm going to write a 1 under the other in the error column. Now this is important for when we go back and analyse each error. On this line we have an error. Even though the child went back and repeated once the teacher told the child what the word was, the first time they appealed, they didn't work out the word on their own, so it is an error. The next error down, you'll notice, is a proper noun. Instead of Benjamin, the child said Ben. So that's an error, but we won't count it the next time we come across it if the child gets that word wrong. So with proper nouns, we only count it as an error the first time. On the next line down, we'll only count the first two errors on that line, live and the sounding out of until. Remember that the child never blended the word together and said it as a whole. They weren't reading for meaning, and that's the whole purpose of reading. So it does count as an error. Now, because we're not analysing that proper noun, we'll take that one word away from our running total and we count how many words the child has read when we calculate accuracy. Now, reading through the full stop and pausing after the word reply doesn't count as an error. This doesn't count as an error either because the child self-corrected. So we put it in the self-correction column, not in the error column. This means that in total, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 errors, and only the one self-correction. If we look up the top here, we can see that we had 101 words in total. One of the words won't be analysed because it was a proper noun error the second time. So there are 100 words that we're analysing. With 7 errors, the child read 93 words correctly, so that means the child read with 93% accuracy, indicating that this text is at an instructional level for the child. Not too easy, not too hard. Once we have a running record, now we get to the most important part, the part that will inform your planning for teaching, analysing the running record. When we analyse a running record, we're looking to see if the child made use of meaning cues when decoding an unfamiliar word. To do this, we look at the error and ask ourselves, does the error make sense in the context of this text? And this includes the illustrations that are provided. So in terms of everything I've read so far and what I can see in the illustrations, does it make sense to say this particular word? This cue is also referred to as a semantic cue. When analysing an error, we also look to see if the child was attending to structural cues or syntax. We ask ourselves, would we say that in the English language? Is it grammatical to say that word? Does it sound right? And does it sound right in the context of what I've read so far, in terms of the tense in which the text is written? And then finally, we also ask ourselves whether the child attended to visual cues, to graphophonic cues, to the graphemes, the printed letters. We're not here referring to the illustrations. Remember, illustrations are what help us make meaning. The V represents the visual cues in terms of the printed word. In terms of the error that the child said, does it look right? Does it match the printed word in any way? So let's now go back to the running record and analyse the errors that this child made. The first error was live instead of lived. I'm going to write MSV in the error column and circle the cues that I think the child used. So the child up to this point, up to this error, the child said, up on a hill in the middle of a forest, there once live. The story is written in the past tense. The child says live, which is in the present tense. I'm going to assume that the child hasn't actually said the word live. The child was looking at the first 3 letters because it doesn't really make sense to say live here. Doesn't make sense in terms of meaning, doesn't fit structurally, but the child did look at the first 3 letters. That did match. So I'm going to circle V for visual cues. Something I personally do that not everyone does is I like to write down which part of the word the child did match so that at the end I can scan down and see if a pattern emerges. Is a child only attending to the first letter, the first few letters, only the ending of the word? Helps me to quickly analyse what the child did. So with the next error, you'll see that there are 2 errors on the same line, and I'm going to analyse each one separately. So for the first error, where the child said little instead of large, I'll put in MSV and ask myself whether I think the child attended to meaning cues, syntactic cues, and visual cues when making that error. Sam lived in a very little. So I'll circle V for visual, but note it was only the first letter. Saying Sam lived in a very little something, remember we're only thinking about what the child has read up to this point. Structurally, it makes sense to put an adjective there. We've replaced one adjective with another adjective. So structurally, the word little does fit within this sentence grammatically. So I'll circle the yes. In terms of meaning, what you can't see is that in the illustration, there was a picture of a little mouse sitting in a huge chair trying to reach up to a table. There were clues in the illustration to show that the house was large compared to this little mouse. So I'm not going to circle the M because the child wasn't attending to all the little clues that were in the text to think about what would make sense. When the child said little again, so Sam lived in a very little house that was far too little. This time I'm going to be a little bit more generous because remember the title of the text was The Mouse and the Bear. We know there's going to be a mouse and a bear in this story. So it could be that the house was too large for the mouse, but that it was far too little, conceivably, for the bear or for something else. So this time, it does make sense to say little. Structurally, it fits. We've got an adjective replacing another adjective. And visually, again, we're only attending to that first letter. So putting in MSV, and this time I'm going to circle all three, but noting that it was only the first letter. Moving down to the next error. In this instance, the child said, but Sam didn't live alone in that very and then asked for help. So in this instance, we're only attending to that first letter, to the visual. We didn't engage in any meaning making. So MSV, only attended to the visual. When the child said Ben instead of Benjamin, he lived in that house with his very best friend, Ben. Here, the child again made use of all three cues. Makes sense to say Ben. Ben is a name, just as Benjamin is. Syntactically, it works, replacing a name for a name. Visually, we've only attended to the first three letters, so it's still an error. With the next error, we've got they live. So I'll put in MSV. Now, it does make sense to say they live. People can live somewhere. So we'll give the child the benefit of the doubt here and circle M for meaning making. Visually, it matches the first three letters, but syntactically, grammatically, the story up to this point has been in the past tense, and the child has now said they live. So syntactically, grammatically, doesn't sound right. So I'm not going to circle the S. As I mentioned before, with until, the child sounded that out, said every letter in the word, so I'll circle the V, but didn't blend it together and turn it into an actual word, didn't engage in meaning making here. It was only really sounding out. Remember, we don't count proper nouns as errors the next time the child makes an error, so I'll skip the second Ben and move down to our self-correction. Now with the self-correction, we have to analyse this one twice. The first time in terms of what the child said when they made an error. So let's do that first in the error column. The child said, I must find a house of my own, Sam replied, and we've talked about how that's impacted on the child's comprehension, but we don't count that as an error. Then the child said, this. That makes sense. Structurally it works because you'll see up here that this quotation started with this, so it makes sense to say that in the context of this story. And visually, the first two letters match. So meaning, syntax, but visually, it was just the first two letters. Now with the self-correction, we have to analyse that too. This time, we ask ourselves, what additional information did the child attend to help them to correct that error? How did they realise that they'd made an error so that they could self-correct it? Given the child was already engaging in meaning making, was already thinking about what would sound right structurally, I'm going to assume that the only additional information that they attended to was the rest of the word visuals. The child looked at the end of the word, and that's what helped them to self-correct. Maybe it's a sight word that's familiar to them. That's quite important to remember, that with self-corrections, we analyse twice, once in terms of the error itself, and the second time thinking about what additional information the child may have attended to help them to correct the error. So if we're to run our eyes down the errors that this child made and have a look at the analysis we've engaged in, if we scroll all the way back up, we can see that the child often looked at the first letter or the first three letters of the word and didn't always look beyond those first three letters when they were making errors. The child potentially also didn't always attend to the tense that the text was written in, the syntactic cues of the text. And if we run our eyes down, the child didn't always attend to meaning making, especially with the two littles. The child didn't always attend to the clues that were given in the illustrations to help them to engage in meaning making with texts. This is just a short introduction on how to analyse a running record, but I hope that you found it useful.